What up, though? February 8th, 2016. The color of money. Confederate currency bill celebrated slavery. Jones' presentation is being co-sponsored by the Plattsburgh State Gospel Choir, which will also perform several songs, and the North Star Underground Railroad Historical Association. Jones argues that the images in mass circulation demonstrate how central slavery was to the Southern economy and to the Confederate States and to the Confederate cause. You hear all these politicians and people who support flying the Confederate flag saying, oh, it's only states' rights. Oh, it's states' rights, all right. States' rights meant it was all right to keep slaves, Jones told the Boston Globe. In 2014, the murder of 9 individuals at a leading black church in Charleston, South Carolina by a white man espousing racist rhetoric led that state's governor and other political leaders to remove the Confederate flag from the State House grounds. Media info, Peter Slocum. Cincinnati.com, The Inquirer. The Confederacy was about preserving slavery. The proof? It's on the money. Byron McCauley, Cincinnati Inquirer, 2018. Confederate loyalists still argue the Civil War was fought over states' rights not to preserve slavery. Don't forget taxes. But if that is true, then how do they explain this? I'm looking at a $5 note issued in by the Eastern Bank of Alabama. It is intricately embossed, not unlike today's American currency. Until you look closer at the art, the proof is right there on the money. Someone took pains to create a beautiful image of slaves picking cotton with another slave at the helm of a wagon with cotton bales on top of it pulled by 4 horses. In the foreground are fluffy bowls of cotton on which the artist wants you to focus. Cotton is king. Our workers, slaves, are happy and well fed, and we put pictures of them on our money to make sure you know it when you spend it. That's what the money seems to be saying. Unlike today's notes, with regal portraits of presidents, there is no honor for the subjects on these banknotes. Cotton is king. Our workers, slaves are happy and well fed, and we put pictures of them on our money to make sure you know it when you spend it. That's what the money seems to be saying. Note, this is the man who wrote the article who says that's what the money seems to be saying. In his estimation, that's what the money is. That's what the figures are saying. That's what the symbolism of the actual currency is saying. He says, unlike today's notes with regal portraits of presidents. When I see today's notes, I see headshots of the presidents, of former presidents. I'm not really sure why he considers these regal headshots, but they are headshots nonetheless. This is part of a new exhibit that opens Friday at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in downtown Cincinnati. It's called Confederate Currency, the Color of Money. I had never seen a Confederate or Southern state note, but I had heard plenty of jokes about something or someone being as worthless as Confederate money. Jones documented more than 126 images of slavery that were depicted on Confederate and Southern states' money. History informs art, which in turn artfully reveals more history, Jones said in a statement. They stay true to the original art, but Jones illuminates and colorizes the images. It is life as seen through the eyes of the people who control the money. Slave moms and babies looking happy in the field. Slave males look healthy and jubilant in nice shirts, even as they toil behind mules or under the weight of a cotton sack. I didn't expect to feel what I felt when I went through the exhibit by myself the other day. Confusion and sadness. I saw in the faces of these slaves people who look very much like me and everyone I had ever known who are members of my immediate family. My brain was trying to work through the fact that these brown faces were ubiquitous on someone's currency of the day. How were they seen by planters, bankers, doctors, lawyers, and merchants? How were they seen by planters, bankers, doctors, lawyers, and merchants? More importantly, how did they see themselves? Maybe the image captures how they saw themselves or how they felt at the particular time. Even more important still, these are images. Images. Let's shake it. Most of the descendants of African peoples see things differently. I'm not sure who he's referring to when he says the descendants of African peoples, other than people who descended from the um, landmass that we call Africa, which, as you all know, consists of 50 plus countries. In each of those 50 plus countries, there are a lot of people, who all have different stories, of which includes each of their bloodlines and lineages. Some of those people may not even call themselves African. They may call themselves by their family names. But the author says most of the descendants of African people see things differently. Most of them. The Confederacy was about a lot of things, but mostly it was about the preservation and accumulation of wealth based on free labor provided by slaves. Just look at the money. Inquirer columnist Byron McCauley is also a member of the editorial board. This is the physical book, the physical copy of the book Confederate Currency, The Color of Money, which I scanned. Images of slavery in Confederate and Southern States currency. Paintings by John W. Jones, edited by Gretchen Barbatsis. Barbatsis. Confederate currency, the color of money, and that's John W. Jones' signature. Introduction. It has sometimes been said that the history of a country is reflected in its money. The engraved images show the slaves as happy, well-treated, and healthy workers in an unnatural state of bliss. Why is this an unnatural state of bliss? Either it is or it isn't. We do not see hardships such as slaves being whipped. Exactly. These images of slavery by engravers of that period are similar to the work of present-day photojournalists, except the positive slave images were used as propaganda. They were designed to actively affirm and aggressively promote the slave labor system of their plantation economy. Yes, the economy that made this earth soil portion, or this landmass that we call America, what it is today. Find your place in the story. Gretchen S. Barbatsis. I didn't even know about it. I had gone to the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture to hear an author speak about her book on the Gullah Geechee culture of Supelo Island off the coast of Georgia. Because the reception and book signing were held in gallery space, I found myself, wine in one hand and light hors d'oeuvres in another, viewing the paintings which hung around the room. The experience was anything but casual, however. In fact, it seemed awkward. I felt confused and embarrassed. Here I was in the presence of images such as slaves picking cotton that seemed to be positive, if romanticized, depictions of slavery. The paintings were large and close up in scale. The light was bright and natural, and the colors were bold and uncomplicated acrylics. Why, I wondered, would the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture be presenting a picture of happy slaves, well-dressed, healthy, smiling, and content to be a part of a brutal system that stole their labor? Why, she asked. Could it be they wanted to be honest? This picture on the left is a picture, it's titled Slaves Picking Cotton. In the right column at the very top is the currency that picture, the original picture, is on, or the original illustration. The presence of a happy, almost carefree image of a slave mother and child presented in the painting, Slave Mother and Child. As we can see, the picture, Slave Mother and Child. This is the origin of that image. And here we have a close-up of that note, and also a close-up of that image on that note. One of my great aunts told me that she was born in a cotton field in Arkansas. And I asked, why were you born in a cotton field as opposed to in the house? And not that there was anything wrong with being born outside. She said that her mother was at work, and because she was at work, she wasn't allowed to give birth in the house of those who she worked for. And so my great aunt was born in a cotton field. So I asked my great aunt, I said, "So you didn't have a house?" She said, "Well, my mother was at work." Again, like I said. And then she said, "Of course we had a house. We've always had a house, a big house." In this image, you can see the American woman, large amount of tobacco. I recognized it as an old piece of paper money, one issued in the South by a bank in Georgia. This exhibition is about an economic system built on the backs of slave labor. With this insight, the images of enslaved Africans, here we go, enslaved Africans, strong men and women along with their children toiling in the cotton fields, hefting the bales and delivering wagon loads of the South's most important commodity to market, took on a poignancy betrayed by happy scenes and smiling faces. The money painting juxtapositions made it clear that these black men, women, and children were part of a system of property and profit. Left column, the bottom. This illustration is called Slave Profits. And in the right column at the top, we see the note, the original note. The image in Admiring Their Slaves of a plantation owner and his wife appraising their property of land and human beings. Both are given the dominance of foreground over the toiling enslaved laborers behind them. As we can see, Admiring Their Slaves is the name of this illustration. Kind of like your shift supervisor or your manager. Finding these images on the currency of southern states and the Confederacy thrust us into a world of people actively affirming and aggressively promoting the slave labor system of their plantation economy. This is a story of enslavement. The engravings tell a story of the Southern way of life, affirming a natural relationship between benevolent owners and happy slaves in servitude to them. What the artist found in painting these vignettes was, in his words, the strong and indomitable character of the slaves, the will to survive and carry on the qualities they brought with them from Africa in the form of music, religion, storytelling, art, architecture, agriculture, and culinary traditions. So through the images, John W. Jones, the artist, and John Jones, the artist, what he saw in these illustrations on the currency was the strong and indomitable character of the slaves, the will to survive and carry on the qualities they brought with them from Africa. He saw this in the illustrations. To survive and carry on the qualities they brought with them from Africa. In the form of music, religion, storytelling, art, architecture, agriculture, and culinary traditions. So you have him, what he saw was these people who were brought thousands of miles away to a landmass that they had that they weren't familiar with. And he saw in these pictures, he saw in these illustrations, these people bringing with them in the form of music, religion, storytelling, art, etc. It almost makes you think that this is a picture book, a pop-up picture book, and the picture is going to pop up and music's going to start playing. The music that these people brought with them. Though he presents the content as originally portrayed on the currencies without revision, through the use of scale, light, color, and visual direct address, he gives voice to the enslaved, and in doing this, creates a contending subject position from which to see and experience this Southern way of life. The artist's use of color, he brings life to the monochrome engravings with highly saturated hues. The colors are primary, bold and uncomplicated. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. His use of color portrays the nobility of his ancestors and of their work. They wear clothing in the ruby, emerald, amethyst, sapphire, pearl, and gold of precious jewels. Poetic. The left column that says a Mississippi slave, Mississippi worker, Mississippi employee of whomever he's working for. The right column, it says a Georgia slaves. This is an illustration of that picture on that currency. And as you can see, these fine Americans are working. And I know, this is blasphemy that they should actually be working and smile at one another and have conversations and still somehow find a way to enjoy life. But wait, there's no blood on these people. They don't look sad or downtrodden or hopeless. Let's shake it. Looking again at the artist's rendering of Moneta, the Roman goddess of money, in the painting Slave Prophets, the artist paints her as a mulatto or as lighter brown skin, symbolizing the economic, political, and socio-cultural exploitation of the slaveocracy that is shamelessly celebrated on its currency. The currencies alone, ornately framed or not, tell the story of an inhumane and failed economic system. If the currencies tell the story of are supposed to tell the story of an inhumane and failed economic system, they didn't do a very good job of it, because none of this looks inhumane. This is the right column. It's this illustration is Slave Boy, and it's from the note right below it. The original note. It's a $50 note, and it says the Central Bank of Alabama, I believe. And here is a close-up of that illustration. American brother doing what he gotta do to make a dollar. Doing what he gotta do to make a dollar. Doing what he gotta do to make $50. He might cash his check and look at the money and see himself on the money. Dr. Al Fraser. Until this highly noteworthy exhibition, deep psychological inhibitions in African Americans may have precluded our studying the relationship between Confederate currency and our history. It seemed better to ignore the blood money associated with the Confederate flag with all the revulsions of slavery. Few experts in African American history, if any, knew that engravings of African Americans on Confederate currency existed. Few experts in African American history. Oh. I understand why they didn't know that engravings of African Americans on Confederate currency existed. Of course they didn't know. That would mean that African Americans actually exist. That would mean that there were people that were actually called African Americans at that time. And this is not true. Jones, his skill as an illustrator, able to render significant detail, enlivens the mostly mundane activities occupying the slaves in the original engravings, where they were portrayed planting, chopping, picking, and transporting cotton, corn, sugarcane, and tobacco. Slaves were also depicted catering food, making barrels, loading ships, grinding tools, butchering hogs, and tending machines in factories. A show of hands or a show of comments, how many people did one of those jobs? Any one of those jobs. Count me in. Jones decided to present the engravings as originally portrayed on the currencies without revision, but to use colorful acrylics on canvas to bring the paintings back to life. Striving for detail in light and reflection, I meticulously draw each painting first and then layer it with color, resulting in very real interpretations of everyday life and landscapes, as well as historical insights into our past, says Jones in summarizing his painting process. He labeled this particular illustration slave overseer with whip. I don't know if it's just me, but the quote overseer unquote, that does not look like a whip to me in his hands. It looks like a stick to beat the horse. Let's shake it. Here Jones selects indigo, another African-derived slave-produced cash crop, to color and reveal American history. Side note, there is also an indigo that is indigenous to the Americas. Right hand corner, right column. Slaves loading ship 1. Current issues suggested by these paintings of daily life during slavery include halting such everyday covert discrimination as voter fraud, police brutality, and higher incarceration rates for blacks that threaten re-enslavement based upon hostile and differential treatment under the law. He says, current issues suggested by these paintings of daily life during slavery include current issues suggested by these paintings. This is what he took from these paintings. Covert discrimination as voter fraud, police brutality, and higher incarceration rates for blacks that threaten re-enslavement based upon hostile and differential treatment under the law. I think the author is reaching. Question mark. Slaves loading ship 2. A majority African American longshoremen's union in Charleston, South Carolina, recently had several of its members, the Charleston Five, jailed after a labor protest that erupted in a violent confrontation with the police. Though the legal charges subsequently were resolved by uncontested pleas, this union can successfully mark its resolute refusal to regress to the days depicted in Slaves Loading Ship 1 and Slaves Loading Ship 2, when slave labor handled all cargo on ships in Charleston Harbor. Reactionary efforts to turn back the clock and rehabilitate the Confederacy confront us. Flying the Confederate flag in public places at state expense, filling public library shelves with works proclaiming that the South was right or that slavery never existed except as myth, reasserting that the war between the states, Civil War, was fought for states' rights and Southern nationalism, not for slavery. Don't forget taxes. Recruiting a small cadre of misguided blacks to support these ideological views. Anyone that goes against the writers, anyone that thinks for themselves, anyone that goes against the writer's thoughts or feelings or narrative, he's labeled a small cadre of misguided blacks. These futile actions based upon psychological warfare tactics, aim to propagandize the world into renewed acceptance of the discredited premises on which the defunct Confederacy was built: egotism, racism, selfishness, and greed. Ironically, without the preservation of Confederate currency, this story would have remained undiscovered. But a contextual difference exists between Confederate chauvinism and legitimate historical preservation. The exhibit gains its power from the multitude of memorable images of slaves, however humble, minds set on freedom, working for America for free. The exhibit gains its power from the multitude of memorable images of slaves, however humble, minds set on freedom. The author is reading the author is saying that he's reading the minds of the slaves. He's reading the minds of the Americans in the illustration. He's reading the minds of the images. He's reading the minds of the illustrations. They present a superb revelation in art of the many and multifarious contributions of African Americans to the economy of the South and the United States during slavery. African Americans moved from being portrayed as equals working alongside whites and Indians to the subservient positions of personal chattel. African Americans, again, it's very difficult to know who he's referring to because at the time of this currency, there were no people called African Americans. Correct me if I'm wrong. Forced to labor under the whip, owned and overseen by whites. This depiction of the little understood transition that African Americans underwent when they first entered the American colonies as indentured servants and then over time were bound by the passage of restrictive laws into slavery or eternal servitude alerts us to be vigilant. Vigilance against restrictive legislation, even in a dangerous era of terrorism, remains crucial today to preserving African American basic freedoms. I'm starting to get an image in my head of the writer of this as a person with shackles on their neck and wrist and like they're running through the woods and like they're being chased, instead of someone who's standing in front of a art exhibition with a glass of wine, eating hors d'oeuvres. In the new millennium, John W. Jones' paintings clarify our view of slavery. They clarify his view of slavery and inspire us with scholarly vigor, craft, artistic creativity, beauty, and truth. Like John, the trickster of slave legend, Jones, has taken the old currency of the Confederacy and transmogrified it economically and philosophically into new money. Black and white collectors have acquired these paintings inspired by old masters' Confederate currency at prices ranging from $1,500 to $6,500 a piece. This exhibition should travel to Washington, D.C. so that government officials may view its many scenes from slavery. If anyone needs a visual smoking gun proving how much and how variously slavery enriched America at the expense of African Americans whose descendants today demand and rightly deserve long promised reparations, John Jones, genre paintings excerpted from Confederate currency provide a plethora of artful, historical, and very convincing evidence of America's great debt to its former slaves. Jack McCrae. Jones' series of fine art renderings of the engravings Confederate currency, the color of money. He has stylishly recreated an object he saw by interpreting it based on his own experience and transforming it in terms of meaning to a level that transcends its initial purpose. Thus ennobling himself, those who encounter the artifact as well as the artifact itself. This improvisational approach to solving the question, who am I, is what's at the basis of the African American view of creativity. Within the African American tradition, the artist seeks to express the universal in particular, elevate the mundane and ordinary to elegance, and seek the sublime in the ridiculous, which the art of painting is eminently suitable to demonstrate. That last paragraph, that that I just read. Within the African American tradition, the artist seeks to express the universal in the particular, elevate the mundane and ordinary to elegance, and seek the sublime in the ridiculous, which the art of painting is eminently suitable to demonstrate. It's a lot to unpack there. It's a it would do you well to read and define each word. Jones' love for these figures comes bearing through in the painting. It comes on the same energy wave that tells the viewer these enslaved Africans live with dignity and respect against all odds. Enslaved Africans. The paintings also have a blues flavor that flows into the viewer's consciousness when looking at them and remains there with a bittersweet aftertaste. Jones' family hails from rural Fairfield County in South Carolina. He grew up around family and to this day travels the back roads of South Carolina, immersing himself in that ambiance and providing himself with intuitive materials with which to inform his art. Much like Edwin Harleston, 1882 to 1931, an African American Charlestonian who painted local scenes and people in the early 20th century. Ironically, African Americans have had the least freedom of all American immigrant groups, despite the inability to navigate society as freely as everyone else. The writers seem to be quite free. And he says, ironically, African Americans have had the least freedom of all American immigrant groups. African Americans have had the least freedom, maybe because African Americans don't exist. And American immigrant groups, either you're American or you're an immigrant. Brought from Africa, a distillation of thousands of years of civilization that included an innate ability to perceive their situation and come up with the strategy that allowed them not only to survive, but also to change their surroundings. That is so romantic. The antebellum days had many whites believing blacks were actually docile, happy, and glad to relinquish the fruits of their labor and technological skill to their masters, just as they're pictured on Confederate currency. This African worldview was most pronounced in the Gullahs, most of whom were in South Carolina, Jones' home state. The planter princes and their descendants who held sway through the war brought Africans in from practically the entire western coast of Africa, particularly the rice coast, to engineer, plant, and harvest the golden rice fields, among other labors. Yes, they brought people from thousands of miles away to a land that they were not familiar with, to engineer, plant, and harvest. As the industrial age barreled along, national transportation emerged, and the middle class grew. Americans bought more and more of the goods they used to make. So advertising grew to a national level, spawning the Aunt Jemimas and the Uncle Bens. Docile, stereotypical blacks were like mascots, warm and fuzzy. So images appeared on everything from patent medicine to chewing tobacco. When I see Aunt Jemima, I see a sister with a scarf on her head. I can't remember if she was smiling or not. And then Uncle Ben on the rice box was a brother face on a box of rice. I'm not sure where they got docile from. I'm just one and on medicine and chewing tobacco, especially chewing tobacco. The Americans have always been known for their tobacco, says the palaces and churches of Europe. I'm just curious, what would make the writer would the writer be pleased if people who look like us weren't on any items, any products? I think people would probably complain about that. Pre-colonial, 1492 to 1526. Black people from Europe. Black people from Europe or Europeans arrived in the New World as slaves, servants, servicemen, and explorers with other Europeans. One of the best known black explorers was Estevanico, aka Esteban, or Little Stephen, who became the first non-American to adventure in what is now Arizona and New Mexico, 1535 to 1539. This is Richard G. Doty. Still in the book, Confederate Currency, The Color of Money. You may be wondering why all those slaves appeared on Southern banknotes. By the middle of the 18th century, all of the original colonies had issued paper at one time or another. These currencies were official. They were printed on behalf of colonial governments, circulated by them, and guaranteed by them. Victory at Yorktown came just in time. The battered insurgent monetary system was given time to revive, but members of the business community looked back at the experience and collectively shuddered. If they had their way, their new country would be one where coinage was king. They put their sentiments and aspirations into a new document called the Constitution, composed in 1787, made law. By 1789, the Constitution spelled out precisely who could issue money, who could not, and what form that money would assume. Only the national government could issue coinage. No state could issue coinage, which some had been doing since the mid 1780s. No state could issue bills of credit. Some other medium of exchange was needed, and needed quickly. If states were out of the money business altogether, and the federal government unable or unwilling to meet the challenge, what was left? Banks were left. The Constitution was silent on whether banks could circulate paper money, probably because Alexander Hamilton and his colleagues had not foreseen an occasion in which they might need to do so. There is no apparent suggestion of subordination in the relationships between blacks and whites in the scene. What scene, you ask? This is an illustration, and below it is the currency that it appeared on. The Bank, Hamburg, South Carolina. One of y'all relatives is on the money, on the currency, just like any of the old presidents is on the currency. Apparently, your ancestors, your family members were just as important, just as significant. Again, there is no apparent suggestion of subordination in the relationships between blacks and whites in the scene. Looking at this scene, I agree. It's called the grinder and slave. Why they gotta call him a slave? Well, slave means worker, laborer, employee. I would say that they're both slaves. This is from a blog. Quite a few years ago, a collector brought an old Confederate banknote and asked John W. Jones to enlarge it. John, a South Carolina born artist and commercial illustrator, was stunned to find that quite a lot of Southern currency depicted scenes of slave labors. After enlarging a Confederate banknote for a customer, I found myself looking at a picture of slaves picking cotton, intrigued and excited. I started After enlarging a Confederate banknote for a customer, I found myself looking at a picture of slaves picking cotton. Intrigued and excited, I started researching and documenting the use of slaves on Confederate and Southern states' money. I was astonished by the widespread use of slaves on these currencies. I present the engravings as originally portrayed on the currencies without revision. I have used my colorful acrylics on canvas to bring the paintings back to life and to extract from the dehumanizing engravings the essential humanity of their subject matter. This one above, titled Slave Boy, was based on an Alabama $50 note issued by the Central Bank of Alabama and a North Carolina $5 note issued by the now defunct Bank of Wadsboro. Where are these banks now? These banks don't exist anymore. There's a Central Bank of America. Can you guess the name? I also included the comments from this blog, from this particular article, because I found the comments to be interesting. These 7 comments. This one is from Dandy. G. The South believed in keeping slaves. How could they ever put slaves on the currency? The most disgusting thing about this art is the unreal way the slaves were depicted. I'm so sure slaves had this big happy smile on their faces while they were picking master's cotton, while master was either beating the slave's children or violating the slave's wife. This crap makes me want to puke. Sorry, but hold on. Let's address that. In the same in the same way we see the illustrations, or in the same way we see the the pictures, the Americans depicted on the currency, this is the same way that we've seen so-called slaves depicted in movies, other propaganda materials like the sardine can slave ship that we often see. People have, T-shirts made of it. How so-called slaves were depicted in Like I said, in these movies that seem to come out or that are made, seems like once every 5 years. So now we have currency with these, quote, slaves, end quote, on the currency, official currency. Whereas the movies that you see with the depiction of what you consider slaves or um, enslaved Africans, those movies are only officially playing at the movie theater. Again, whereas the currency is official. Nikki Springstraw. Sorry, but this is crap because this is the worst thing that I have ever seen in my whole life. The worst thing that she has ever seen in her whole life are people working. I didn't see any blood in any of those pictures. I didn't see any violations happening, any beheadings, anybody getting shot. I didn't see nobody getting popped. Illustrated on that currency. If you're going to make a picture from the time where slavery was in tune, then make it a little more realistic. Wow. How much more realistic can you make it? It's on the actual currency. Maybe she means make it more realistic like how it is in the movies. So there are no smiles on the slaves' faces. It was the worst thing if you were a slave. Bet you never thought about that, did you, when you painted this stupid, crappy art? How selfish and what a fool you are. That's an angry person. This is some of the most beautiful and original art I've seen in a long time. Snapshots of the 1850s. In the 1850s, the 1850s is not long ago. And you know, I think some of the reasoning behind these people, like the previous comment, which said that this was the most disgusting thing or this is the worst thing that they ever seen in their lives. I think they say this because they don't see their family in history. They don't see their family in the story. And the reason for that is because you would have to know who your family is in 1850. If you know who your family is in 1850, then you can place your story within his story. You can see where you fit into his story or history. But you have to find out your story first. And it's meticulous, but it's not difficult. And it's very fulfilling. Depictions of life in the Old South. History is history. Accept it instead of trying to revise it to suit your political correct 21st century viewpoints. Your BS of today will be looked upon as bunk by future free thinkers. Americans, whether white or black, need to get over the whole slavery issue. All great nations and empires were built on slaves. The Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, Ottoman Empire, the British Isles, Nordic countries, Japan, Canada, and the Aztec Empire, etc. The list can go on forever, really. That's just the way it was. And another fact, slavery was not always based on race, but on religion and status as well. Christians have enslaved non-Christians. Christians have been enslaved. Muslims have had slaves, etc. Instead of being so sensitive about it and offended by it, accept it as a part of history and be happy and thankful it is no longer a continued practice in the U.S. You sure? Slavery was abolished in 1865. Are you sure? In the U.S. It's time to move on. No African American that exists, no African American exists, was ever a slave. And there is no need to apologize now for something in the past that was acceptable and necessary. And before assuming all slaves were discontent and abused, get the facts. That's definitely not true. Although I will agree that being the slave of the nicest master doesn't compare to being free. What do you know about freedom? You listening, what do you know about freedom? Do you have a water source? Do you manage your own sewage, your own waste? Do you provide your own heat, your own electricity? Do you grow your own food? Do you hunt? Do you fish? Do you make your own clothing? Let's shake it. BBC. Harriet Tubman. Biden moves to put anti-slavery activists on $20 bill. The Biden administration has said it will seek to push forward a plan to make anti-slavery activist Harriet Tubman the face of a new $20 bill. A note featuring Miss Tubman, who was born a slave in about 1822, was originally due to be unveiled in 2020. The U.S. Treasury said she would replace former President Andrew Jackson, a slave owner. But the effort was delayed under former President Donald Trump, who branded it pure political correctness. This is from ABC News. Democrats protest delay of Harriet Tubman $20 bill. Want Congress to require it. Adia Robinson, 2019. House Democrats on Thursday protested on the steps of the Treasury Department, rallying for a congressional measure that would require $20 bills to include an image of abolitionist and Civil War spy Harriet Tubman. Congressional measure that would require $20 bills to include an image of abolitionist and Civil War spy Harriet Tubman. House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, Rep. Hakeem Jeffries, Rep. Ayanna Pressley joined Rep. Joyce Beatty in support of the Women on the 20 Act. The Democrats spoke about Tubman's history and courage while holding signs that read, "Show me the Tubmans," and "Tubman on the 20." Beatty had the phrase stamped on the back of her white blazer. The picture says, they say, "We need a Tubman 20 now." This was published 3/2/2023. Shaheen renews push to put Harriet Tubman on $20 bill. Senator Shaheen has led efforts in the Senate for years pushing the U.S. Department of Treasury to feature Harriet Tubman's likeness on the $20 bill. Washington, D.C. As Women's History Month gets underway this week, U.S. Senator Jean Shaheen, Democrat, New Hampshire, renewed her nearly decade-long push to put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill by introducing the Harriet Tubman Tribute Act of 2023. Tubman would be the first woman and first black American to be printed on a U.S. bill denomination. Tubman would be the first woman and black American to be printed on a U.S. bill denomination. Images on U.S. paper currency are a reflection of our values and history. And more than that, these images send a message to Americans and world travelers about the story of America. Some of the most significant chapters of our collective history were shaped by women, which is why it's egregious that a woman has never been featured on U.S. paper currency. Do the right thing.